Hey, it's Lit with Lit Tower Strength. We're going to dive into optimal versus acceptable technique and why it may or may not matter whether or not you optimize something. Optimization is kind of like this big thing with all these YouTube bros and all these science and evidence based lifters. But here's the thing, for most people, depending on the goal you're chasing, optimal is something that we may never get to. Okay. Not to pick a bone with Squat University, but when we look at the optimization of movement, right, and looking at injuries and thinking it's because of some sort of uh, movement non-optimized, path or pattern, the problem that we get into is that for a majority of people, not optimizing a movement still doesn't mean that they're not going to get something out of it. So when we talk about optimal technique versus acceptable technique, we need to understand that not everything you do in the gym is going to be optimal. And you're also not going to get hurt by doing something not optimally. Okay. That's why we start to look at the levels of technique. I got this question when I was working in a high school setting. We had an intern come in watching all the different things that were happening, freshmen that were trying to do RDLs, and they look like turtles and they're all bent over and hunchback, versus the kids that look perfect, and saying, well, why don't you correct all the time, correct the round back kids? And say, well, we have three levels of technique. We have optimal, which is what we'd like to get to. We have acceptable, which means we're not going to get hurt, and we are going to occasionally try to move it towards optimal. And then we have dangerous. We're going to fix dangerous and move it to acceptable as fast as we can. Over time, then we can start to move acceptable technique to optimal technique, because it doesn't matter all that much for a majority of people it's unless the weight room is the goal. I'm talking powerlifters, weightlifters, strongman. The goal of moving from acceptable technique to optimal technique doesn't actually matter that much for people when they hit the gym. We need to be in a range of acceptable technique, because that's going to help prevent any biomechanical injuries. But when we look at injuries themselves, most of them aren't an issue of technique. Unless it's dangerous technique, then most of those injuries are actually going to come from load and volume management. So when we start to look at acceptable versus optimal technique, we like to think of these rules. Okay. Dangerous technique is that there's inconsistency from rep to rep and set to set, meaning none of those reps look the same during a set. And from set to set, they also don't look the same. We tend to look at these as our motor morons in the weight room. Okay. And again, I'm going to go back to my time in the high school setting, because when you get freshmen that come in and they've gained 4 inches over the summer between eighth grade and freshman year, they all of a sudden don't know how to move anymore. It's like putting Bambi on ice skates. We start to look at dangerous technique, and we can't really load dangerous technique to a great extent. There is some level of, again, dangerous, what I call dangerous technique. There is a level of danger to it because it's inconsistent. If we can start to make movement patterns more consistent, we get to acceptable. When we look at acceptable technique is going to be consistent 90% of the time. So, yeah, maybe we can even say 80% of the time. If I have 5 reps, 4 of them look great, 1 of them looks that's okay, right? We're talking about minor little things. Maybe my knees come in a tiny little bit on 1 rep on a squat, or maybe I get a little bit out of a neutral spine on 1 rep of an RDL or a deadlift. Maybe all of a sudden my elbows flare or like twist when I'm doing a bench press on a rep. If all of a sudden out of a set of 3, 2 reps are good, 1 rep is kind of iffy, that's fine. Most people aren't going to get hurt by that standpoint. Now, if we apply load and a lot of volume to dangerous technique, yes, we're going to run into biomechanical issues. If we apply too much load and too much volume to acceptable technique, we're going to run into overuse injuries. So it's not necessarily a matter of the biomechanical issue and biomechanics being dangerous. It's the fact that we're loading too much. It's where most injuries come from. Now, if you're a weightlifter, if you're a power lifter, that optimal technique is going to be very, very important. Okay, so when we look at the difference between acceptable and optimal, optimal means it looks the same every time. Sometimes it even looks wrong every single time, but it looks the same every single time. Okay. And I'm talking about when we say like looks wrong, there is some level based on individual body proportions where technique is going to look a little bit different. The weightlifting technique of the Chinese weightlifting team is going to look very homogenous. It's going to look very, very similar to each other, but it's going to look pretty different from American weightlifting technique because there's a lot more diversity within the country itself, and the genetic makeup is a lot more diverse. We start to look at weightlifting technique, and you're going to see variances. The thing in terms of optimizing technique means that we're going to optimize the technique for the individual doing the exercise. And then when we're in there, most of those injuries are going to come from volume and load. It's not usually the one rep that was off. If you're just going to the gym to work on fitness, your goal is to move to acceptable technique as fast as you can. That way you can handle the volume and the load, and you can do a lot of reps, and you can do a lot of sets, and you can handle what we call like total tonnage. That's going to impact your health and fitness more by having an acceptable technique because you're actually going to be able to drive output a little bit better. You're recruiting the muscle fibers in the right way, in the right sequences. You're able to actually use mechanics to efficiently lift loads. You're going to get a lot more output. If you can take time to work towards optimal, that'd be great. But at least get to consistency and get to acceptable because that's where we're really going to drive outputs and we're going to see a bunch of changes. All right. This is always the big thing because if you look at sports performance, you look at strength and conditioning, a lot of people will see coaching and they'll see bad reps here and there. And they'll say that coach isn't doing their job. Well, if 90% of the reps look the same and are acceptable technique and they're not going to get hurt biomechanically from how bad the form is, then we're fine, right? The thing we have to understand, especially if it's in a sport performance or health and fitness context, if we're in acceptable technique and we can still drive output without biomechanical injury due to that, we're going to be able to then get the adaptations that we want from the exercise we're pursuing. Meaning, if I am pursuing sport performance in, say, football, well, my job is not to be necessarily good at the weight room. The weight room is there to drive adaptations, but my job is to be a good quarterback, receiver, lineman, you name it. The weight room is there to add potential to my skill, but the skill is actually the thing that's going to drive the output on the field, which is what matters. Same thing happens when we look at, say, track and field, right? Or running sports. Well, the ability to produce the force and get into the right gait cycle patterns aren't necessarily going to be uh, enhanced by optimizing the weight room technique. As long as that weight room technique is acceptable and we're able to get output from it and drive the adaptations we want, that's where it's actually going to matter. Same thing if I were in baseball. Same thing if I were in, especially those really fine motor sports like golf. Okay, you start to look at some of those really fine motor movements. As long as I can get acceptable technique in the weight room and I'm not going to hurt myself there, I can drive the output that gets me the adaptations, and those adaptations translate back to my skilled sport where I'm going to have to actually put most of my brain power to in order to optimize the skill there because that's the thing that drives the actual performance. All right. So if you're getting into the gym and you're starting out, your goal is to move from dangerous technique to acceptable technique as fast as you can. And over time, you start to optimize things, but it doesn't need to be the thing you focus on the most. You need to get to a point where your movement is consistent and your movement doesn't look different rep to rep and it's in an acceptable range. And then over time, you start to add those skills of optimizing an exercise or optimizing a movement because you're going to get those adaptations and it's going to allow you to then take your physical capabilities and layer skills on them to be able to perform in a specific task, sport, endeavor, you name it. And that's what's really going to make a difference in your training and in your fitness.